It is a pleasure having all of you here today to talk about Dataspaces. Are you excited? Yeah, yay! We just had lunch, we're tired. So I'm so thrilled you're all here. My name is Christina Drummond, and I am here to kick us off today. I want to start, of course, with our acknowledgement of country, to acknowledge the first Australians whose lands we're meeting upon, and pay respect to their elders, past, present, and future. With that, I also, in terms of housekeeping, you've all seen this slide. I do want to emphasize are there folks in here who are not yet members of the RDA? Because if you're not, please join. It is a wonderful way for us to gather, to advance common goals, and to basically talk through the things we don't know yet. And as you're going to hear today, Dataspaces are really new, and there's a lot we don't know. I like to say this is cutting-edge innovation, and we're working on that research and development together. For the purposes of this session, we have a couple objectives. First of all, we wanted to start by providing an overview, because how many people in here know what a dataspace is? Okay, a couple. Hey, that's a lot. I did this 3 years ago, and no one knew what it was, and they're all like, a data commons? No. So we're going to talk about that a bit. And then we're going to hear some presentations from some of the countries that are supporting Dataspaces, as well as the effort I represent, the OA Book Usage Data Trust, which has implemented a proof of concept data space for research impact metrics. After that, we really want to turn this into a group discussion, because as I mentioned before, the RDA gives us a place where we can identify shared needs and start working to solve those together. And so we want to have this group help us to understand if there's something we should be doing with respect to Dataspaces as a community and what that might be. Sound good? I'm going to be, we got to wake you guys up. So who's ready to start with Dataspaces? In a big picture, I'm a visual thinker, so I want to talk you through a little picture as we get started and settled in to help you understand where Dataspaces are and how they came to be. So for folks who haven't heard Dataspaces, let's take it all back. I'd like to start with, you all know what a database is, right? Relational databases, yes. We'll do this with hands. Raise your hand, because I'm trying to wake you up, if you know what a database is. Excellent, that's what I was hoping to see. I'll keep it up there, keep it up there. Okay, do you know what a data mesh is? Okay, how about a data lake? Okay, someone back up, good. Okay, and then data brokers? Okay, helpful, and then data space. We already met it before. So what we're seeing here is a progression, and we're talking about legal interoperability. And if you start thinking about that in-house, we all work with our data management plans, our data stewards, to understand in our own institutions how we manage data, what the risks are, how we bring the data together across silos, and where that risk may be. That's easy when you're inside a single institution. Now, as all of you know, with data commons or repositories, often you have to exchange that data, and we do that right now through one-to-one bilateral agreements most often. That takes effort, that takes a lot of complex negotiation, and it takes time. The data brokerage industry really evolved to solve some of those problems. But who here can shout out, I'm trying to wake you up, who here can shout out one challenge with working with a data broker? Anyone? Licensing. What else?
Formats.
What was that?
Formats.
Anything else?
Accessibility.
There can be multiple challenges when working with an organization that is acting as that single point that has essentially harvested and collected all the data to then serve up to others. And I would say that the data space effort has evolved, and this is actually part of the European digital strategy, to, in response in many ways to data brokerage, to allow for not only data sovereignty, but at a transactional level, enable these data connectors that give you the ability to share data with very specific who does it need to be shared with, for what purpose, at what time, at a transactional level, things we historically haven't been able to do. So the work I'm going to represent today is much bigger than me. I'm the executive director implementing a data space, but I'm standing upon the shoulders of many who have come before and continue to drive this work forward. This work that I'm going to be talking about, the data space approach, is something that is fostered through multiple foundations and organizations, lead being the International Dataspaces Association. And so I'm going to do my best here to represent the work that has come before, but I won't put a big asterisk next to that. So with that, I want to start with, if you're new to Dataspaces, where should you start? The Design Principles for Dataspaces is an incredible document that lays out both the governance building blocks and the technical building blocks that are key to this infrastructure. It describes how a data space fits alongside other infrastructures that we're working with. But I'll note that from that keystone document, this movement has evolved through to develop an open architecture with documentation. It's now in its 5th version for the reference architecture, all of which is open. It's in GitHub. And now there's actually a Dataspace Protocol that is in draft form at ISO. That said, it still may not be clear what a data space is. And I often like to liken it to a protocol level approach. In the same way the internet is neutral, the Dataspace Protocol is a way for us to add the control layer to the way we exchange data. I know in this community, we're very familiar with GORC, and I often have people say, well, is a data space a data commons? And I thought it might be useful to kind of overlay or try to overlay these two concepts to talk through it. Now, the IDSA, the International Dataspaces Association, you see the graphic here on the bottom comes from their brochure. They do maintain assets for the good of community and this movement. They have the reference architecture model that is evolved in this community. They do maintain a test bed. They have certification programs for different elements. We'll look at those in a moment. In addition to the protocol that they're working forward, and the rule book, which talks about governance and interoperability. They're also looking at training programs to help people understand that concept. But one thing I do want to flag, whether you're talking about the IDSA as an organization or the data spaces that come online, like the one I lead, one key factor to a data space is it does not hold the data of the parties that are exchanging it. There is no centralization of the data. It stays sovereign. So it's, I would like to propose, if you think of research objects as data, it's not a commons because there is no centrally held data. Instead, what we have are data connectors that enable dynamic transfer through what we would call infrastructure as code. Now, that said, to put everyone's mind at ease, within the GORC framework, we of course have a lot of infrastructure elements, and those we do see shared within the data space model, both in the infrastructure itself and the global coordination. So as I mentioned, the reference architecture, certification programs, the technical test bed, all of the documentation and training are key components to sustaining this infrastructure as it grows. Also, you need to have that community governance. And whether you're talking about the IDSA as an association or the singular data spaces, and I'll talk about ours in a moment, later in this hour, there is a sustainable community behind it. So the IDSA itself is a staffed membership organization. They do have a rule book that talks about how they function to make that all transparent. And there are regular meetings and working groups that anyone can participate in, much like the RDA. But to talk about the data space as an architecture, I think it's helpful to see this graphic, and this actually comes from the International Dataspaces website, if you go to internationaldataSpaces.org/y/dataspaces. And what it does is really provide a space. I think that third dimension, as you saw on that first map, where in this space you can have neutral data contracts that are machine actionable and negotiated. To do that, as everyone here probably knows, you of course have to have trust between the parties that are sharing it. And the ones who are making it available have to have legal authority to do so. And the ones who are receiving it have to take on the responsibility that comes with that data. To instill trust in this entire ecosystem, though, you also need to have trusted coordination. You need to ensure that the parties that are running the system and providing the foundational elements, whether they are apps or the identity verification and provision, the vocabularies, these of course also have to be trusted. The data connectors themselves, as you see, is the heart of how this scales and functions. So when you talk about a data space, it's not so much that you have a repository of data, but what you have are these connectors that flow from the left, from the data provider, where they configure a data connector for a set of data, and they apply usage policies and terms to that. So if we think of our licensing agreements, those can get very granular. What this is allowing us to do is to move that to a transactional level. You could get, the model allows you to get as granular as this group of people or organizations for a specific time, for a specific use case. You could attach it, for example, to an agent that could only pull the data for certain instances. There's a lot of things that are still evolving here, but essentially the matchmaking becomes machine actionable because you then have data consumers on the other end, or we call them data recipients in our world with my data space. But you have the entity that needs to call that data and access it, push or pull. And they're going to seek out their data spaces using their own clearinghouse, and the machines then make sure there's a match or let someone know. So it becomes a data marketplace in many ways, but with the ability to audit and have transparency around the data exchange, because each one of these are logged and viewable by the data provider and the consumer. I started my career in the internet, so I like to think of things in levels and tiers. So this is my version of how I think about this, and we were just talking about the technology stack. But as we've all talked about, trust is about more than technology. The technical stack is what you see in the middle. It is the connectors between the providers and the recipients that work at scale to match those data access terms and make sure that the request for data and how that data is provisioned match. But to make that possible, you need to move from implicit trust, which is what we do today with identity authentication management. I know your organization, they know who you are, therefore we grant you data access. That implicit trust then shifts to being explicit from an endpoint to endpoint transaction level. So that's where we have to then think through what are trust indicators, what are the usage policies, how do we take what is in those legal data sharing and use agreements and get very specific to make those machine actionable at scale. That comparison from the metadata about trust indicators, that all happens at that dynamic provision and access and audit layer when the data is unlocked and flows. That is the bottom level. But all of this has to be governed. It has to be governed by an entity that can coordinate the data space and ensure that the participants can be trusted, that they have the legal authority, I'll use those words, to manage the data and make it accessible. And you also want this community governance to be trusted by its users. In our instance, we have a board of trustees, but you can think about how that might map to things like the CARE principles. Who gets to be in that body governing this space? Come on in. So we're going to hear a lot about what data spaces are and how we're done, but I want to underscore that this is very much in its early stages. Even though it's been even though it's been developing for almost a decade, there is still a lot we have to learn. And I pulled this from the International Dataspaces brochure, which is the QR code at the top. And as you can see here, the Dataspaces Association is actively working to ensure that the concepts coming out of this movement are in alignment with the other standards bodies at the global level. But they're also trying to pull together and learn from the data spaces that are actively bringing online data connectors between public and private entities and a lot of different domains. There are active data spaces that are up and running, like Katina X in the automotive industry, the mobility data space that's working relative to urban planning, and others. So it's worth knowing that there's a lot here. Some of open source solutions are being managed by their own foundations at this point. The working groups are open to folks who are members of the association. And as you can see, there's kind of a deep set of very active working groups. Everything from architecture, maintaining that reference architecture model, and you can see the other kinds of subgroups that they have. The certification group, how do we know that an element in this model is what it says it is? How do we provide that certification to the community? Maintaining the test bed for everyone who wants to explore data spaces. The rulebook, we'll talk about rulebooks in a moment, but this is the articulation of the legal and organizational interoperability frameworks for a given data space. In this case, they also maintain one for the IDSA itself, which, as you see as a dependency, has a legal working group to support that as well, to talk about a lot of the issues that are coming up as we're trying to take contracts and data sharing agreements and make them machine actionable. And then raising awareness about data spaces through events, trainings, conferences, and identifying the body of knowledge itself is something that is underway. There's some more seats in the front if anybody wants to come on up. We're informal here, please. So I do want to note that the Dataspaces radar is something they publish to identify all of the different efforts that are growing. And there are a lot of stages. As we'll talk about later, mine's kind of now just entering the blue. But each Dataspace itself has to understand what their use case is. What are these parties coming together to share data about? Where is the value? When do they have a critical mass of parties that are willing to exchange that data? And then how do they move towards that pilot? And there are over 145 different efforts that are working across the space right now. I'm just one of them. And so in closing, I think the key here is to think of a Dataspace as a protocol that helps to unlock data sharing through that secure and sovereign component where the data providers can set the terms at a very granular level. And then data recipients can find the data that matches, and then if it doesn't match, negotiate that outside of the data space. So the data space reflects the in real life agreements that are being brokered, but in a machine actionable way. Ultimately, this does get us closer to data-free flow with trust, which some of you may have heard about. And it does that through things like transparency, having the disclosures about the data so people know what they're getting, having accountability measures built into these ecosystems so that if there is an issue with the data, if there is an issue with one of the actors participating in the data space, there is a mechanism outside of taking them to court that you can use then to resolve that in a proper manner. And one thing I want to end on is the importance of neutrality. So often, and I should say that the Dataspaces model has been developed to be industry agnostic, to be technology agnostic, and data agnostic, insofar as the types of data that can flow through this can be diverse. The key is to think of this as, I would say, making the legal contract layer in negotiation not only granular at the transaction level, but something that can be applicable and extended to other kinds of data exchange that we all encounter in our work. How was that for a way to sit down after lunch? You guys still with me all awake? That was like, oh, I like it. They're clapping. Thank you. Well, that was just step one. So you're stuck with us for 90 minutes, one way or another. So what we want to do today is not only raise awareness of what this Dataspaces model is, but raise awareness on how some of us are thinking about this. All honesty, 3 years ago, I had a BOF for RDA when during the pandemic, we did this online, 2 people showed up. This makes me so happy. So thank you, everyone, for being here. What we're going to do next is hear from some of the initiatives looking to understand, support, and work with Dataspaces. Then you'll get me again. I'll talk about what I'm doing for the Scholarly Communications Dataspace. But then we're going to shift into our group discussion. So with that, Kheeran.
Thank you, Christina. So look, it's fantastic to see so many people come here at this time. It's the last session, and thank you for all of you for joining. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're doing in Australia on Dataspaces. So, yes, so I'm part of ARDC, and it's fantastic to have Rosie here, who's the CEO of it. So ARDC's mission is to accelerate research within Australia and innovation and drive that excellence in there. So we're constantly looking at what we can do better to make that better and make that environment more accessible and make more of that data available in there. I'll just put this up because, and I think I'm not going to dwell on this, but we've been talking all through this week around the challenges that are there, the data sovereignty, the trust, all of those have been in there. And these are some of the reasons why we started looking at Dataspaces. So IDSA has been tracking Dataspaces for a little while and is a member of the IDSA. And around early last year, I was thinking, it's time to look at bringing this to Australia and see what it means and does it make sense. So that's where this initiative started off. Again, here you can see that in this strategy that we talks about this complexity of the data that's happening. And many strategies talk about that complexity, how we need to make that available. And a lot of the reviews that happen are also talking about the same sort of challenges in there. So as Christina already covered most of these things, so I don't really need to cover this part again. But what we're trying to do is trying to say, from that centralized model that's there, what do we need to do here to be able to shift to that decentralized model, that data space is there? Does that make sense here or not? And another view of the data spaces is that you can look at it at the ecosystem level. What do we need to have data spaces in the plural sense, and for those to be interoperable and those to be coherent enough. And then there is the instance of data spaces, implementations of that in there. And the program is bridging these two at this point, looking at what is needed in this ecosystem when we're bringing it to Australia. It's evolved in European context. When it comes to Australia, does it make sense here? Can we do it? And what do we need to do? And on the other side, it's a new concept here. So again, that's about building that awareness and capacity within our community to say, data spaces is a thing, have a look at it. What does that mean? Does it apply new spaces that having value in there? We're kind of taking a phased approach. So the first phase we're looking at it is, does it make sense? Is it viable? Is it valuable here? And if that makes sense, then we start to look at what comes next and what does that look like together. So it's fairly clear from what the work we have done so far that there is a lot of, it's viable here. Not wanting just to lift and shift, but there is some changes that needs to happen. And we need, so for example, the rule book, that's a key document in there, requires a fair bit of work around what does it mean when we put Australian legislation in there. Right? Some of the assumptions that are in there don't hold true when you apply the Australian legislation. So what do we need to do that, and how do we bring that together? But overall, the concept really echoes here, and there's been lots of interest. And is it valuable? Does it add value? And from the work we've done with the people we worked with, and many of them are here as well, it does seem to echo, and it does have that value to be able to decentralize, to reduce that burden of data sharing and bilateral agreements, and release the bilateral agreements out of it. So the program itself, we structured it around 5 different themes. We talked about what we need to do to adopt and adapt it to here, and a big part of it was do a couple of pilots, look at the frameworks, start testing the waters to see what we need to do. I talked about the building the capacity, so we started looking at what's the skills we need to have, what do we need to do, and start to bring that here and work with the community on building that knowledge pool, getting that feedback as to what it takes to bring it here. Another part of it was looking at the supporting capabilities and services that we might need to have. One of the early parts of this was we need a test bed here to get the people to have a look at it, test it, poke around with it, work out how does it map against what we're currently doing and what they need to do. So that's one part, but then informing what else we might need to have going forwards as well. The fourth one we called shaping the landscape, and that's really looking at that ecosystem level, saying what's the policy institutional frameworks that are in Australia that might get in the way or not get in the way, and what might we want to do in there to really understand that, and then start to think about how we can make that a bit better and more conducive to data spaces. And finally, as ARDC, one of our roles is to really contribute back into the international space. So the team has been involved and continues to be involved in IDSA's working groups and contributing back to the ISO standards, into the knowledge and the RAM reference architecture model. So we're taking our knowledge from what we're gaining from here and contributing it back in there. I won't cover this in too much, but these are all the actual details of what we've done. So we have got 2 pilots going, one in the environmental space and one in the biosecurity space. They're in the early spaces, but again, that's when it's really saying, working with industry, working with government, working with the researchers, bringing that together, unlocking that. Some of the challenges that systems that we've been working with, really makes sense to really start to flip that around and start to look at them as data spaces. In there, yeah, I'm not going to, we can probably talk more of these ones as we get into the sessions, into the open sessions, but in this part, we've done a lot of work in trying to contextualize it to Australia. And I think that especially that middle one is probably useful, where we've tried to take the material that's in from IDSA and in Europe. We tried to initially start reuse that, but we found that it's very difficult to understand in the Australian context because the assumptions are different, the way we think about it are different. So the team's done a lot of work and fantastic work in trying to build some introductions that echo with Australia and FAQs around that one, so that might be helpful as well for others as well. Yeah, I'm going to stop there, and hopefully I was on time, but yeah, thank you. We're not taking questions.
Okay. Right. Good afternoon, everyone. Does this work? Yeah, perfect. So nice to see a full room. Yesterday I was thinking that people would be, off in the pub by now. But I'm glad to be proven wrong. So my name is Ulriika Vihervalli from CSC in Finland. For those of you who don't know CSC, we provide HPC data management services, digital infrastructure for Finnish researchers and research performing organizations. And probably not the first time you've heard this week. This is not my presentation, but I'm giving it on behalf of my colleague Heidi Laine, who at CSC is our contact person for Dataspace Alliance Finland, but she could not be here this week, so I will be giving this on her behalf, as well as my other colleague, Pihla Kauranen, who is also our Dataspace Alliance person. So, what is the Finnish Dataspace Alliance? First of all, not a dataspace. So we can make that clarification there. It is a forum of currently 27 Finnish organizations who are engaged with dataspace-related activities. And this was established relatively recently, in 24. And the members are both public and private actors, enabling and supporting dataspace development, so that both includes then research infrastructures, businesses, research institutions, and businesses, and so on. So the goal there is to really raise awareness on dataspaces, available resources, what are they, and increase activity on a national level. And I think the fact that there's already 27 organizations involved at a national level, it gives a pretty good indication that this has had good uptake, even though it's still relatively early on. And here's a bit of a picture from the website, and the website is there listed for you as well. Again, giving this vision for this Dataspace Alliance. Again, very much emphasizing that it's this community effort at this point, and really a support action, I suppose, in a way as well. The governance, good news, no membership fee, so that's nice, we'll take it. But what do you need to do then to join the alliance? Well, this is done through the signing of a memorandum of understanding. And the criteria, there is some criteria here, so it is expected that members are involved in a dataspace initiative. So if you're just dataspace curious, unfortunately that's not enough for you to join. The expectation is that you are involved in an initiative one or another. Now, this alliance is facilitated by Finnish Information Society Development Center, or TIEKE in Finnish, as well as the technology industries of Finland. And the alliance meets 4 to 5 times per year in person, which is doable because Finland is it's a big country in a European context, but we're in Australia, so distance-wise it's small, from an Australian perspective. So there are these in-person meetings several times a year with active discussion on current dataspace issues and development. But then on top of these regular meetings, there are also ad hoc deep dive sessions on specific themes, or there might be BOFs, for instance, and I'll give you an example in just the next slide. Now, the sustainability of this alliance is based on in-kind contributions from members. So the aim of the alliance itself is not really focused on how do we sustain this alliance, but rather really what we're hoping for here is that the alliance is a catalyst at a national level for data space development. So despite being relatively young, there are some outputs that I think are notable already at this stage and certainly very helpful in the national context. So these include an overview report on the data of data spaces in Finland, and this is regularly updated and maintained. So that means we always have a good understanding of the national landscape. The Alliance also maintains a Finnish Dataspaces catalogue. So that's another very valuable resource. And I said that there's sometimes this ad hoc or deep dives into specific themes, for instance. So the last one is an example of this. So the Alliance also organizes campaigns. So for example, data as a growth platform for SMEs, so small or medium enterprises. And there's a PDF leaflet there, so if anyone's interested, by all means, you can return to these slides and take a look of what the kind of campaign material there looks like. So it's been quite productive in its first few years already, and it's already gotten quite a lot done that really helps us in getting a national sense check of where are we and in what directions are we developing. Now, obviously, from CSC, I have my CSC hat on in terms of also looking at this alliance. And for us, this is really part of a wider European data space development that is happening right now, and happening on many different levels. So not just this national level, even though I've been focusing on it, but there's a lot going on. So in the European context, the European Commission aims to harvest the value of data for European economy and society, and they've laid this out in the European Data Strategy. So if you love reading strategies, there you go. But what's really been set up is the common European data spaces. So that's a really big initiative, and linked to that is also the Dataspaces Support Center for those who are still finding their way through this topic. And in terms of the Alliance, Dataspace Alliance Finland, and I think if those previous slides showed it also, is that for the Dataspace Alliance Finland, we have the industry half to it, and the industry half is quite a big factor and big driving force in it as well. So that very much falls into the scope. But then for CSC, so we are part of this network, but then at CSC we are also, have this other hat of public-driven data spaces. These then include European Health Dataspace, which is currently being set up, being formed, obviously very much with the aim there that this is a place where we can find a way to share health data in this European context. Another, the last one, European Language Data Space there, again, kind of similar idea for language data. Then in the middle, also very important, is the European Open Science Cloud, which isn't just to do with data, that also very much focuses on tools and services and being able to share these in a federated network across European nodes. And the federation of the European Open Science Cloud is actually going to materialize and become operational in a few weeks' time. So there's a lot going on in the wider landscape that all link to this. And then from the CSC perspective, we are very much keen to be involved in the national conversation and help and support the data space development there. And then also we are kind of linking all of this then back to these wider European initiatives. And I think over the next few years we'll see a lot of development in both of these spaces. So that's where we are now. Thank you so much for your attention.
Awesome. Back again. Sorry. So I'm here to talk about what I would call one of those industrial data spaces to the extent, it's interesting. So I've been working in scholarly communications, and the work that I'm presenting to you today really came out of a need on the open access book side. So we've been funded through the Mellon Foundation now. And you'll see this here in a moment in the United States. And this really came about as a project because we have a number of humanities book scholars who wanted to tell their story of impact. How many people have struggled with that? How do I know what my impact is in open science? Oh, we have a couple. That said, it's been different than it is in the journal world with the STEM because all of this access data, when it's open access, it's distributed. And pulling that together is a challenge. But as we started going down this path and asking questions about how to solve this, what we quickly learned was that the publishers, the presses, the libraries wanted the same usage data to be aggregated and benchmarked to provide context for operational decision making. They want to understand what platforms are working with what niches, audiences. They want to be able to target their own operations in a strategic manner. I like messy drawings, as you can tell. So the challenge, of course, with open science is that those outputs are discoverable and distributed across the internet. And this is across geographical boundaries. This is across legal boundaries, institutional boundaries. So going back to interoperability, this presents a challenge. And so our origin story really began with how do you just pull all the data together? And as we've been talking about, of course, that was hard. We have a lot of commercial entities in scholarly publishing and communications that are not just going to hand over that information because it is seen as proprietary, if not sensitive. Yet, here we are. We know we need to handle research impact reporting. So starting just with the narrow use case of open access books and the usage of that scholarship, we've been working through Mellon for now a decade, and the most recent 6 years, $2.4 million of investment, to understand the use case, to understand the challenges, the data supply, like the supply chains, and how this data flows through the ecosystem. And it wasn't until the Data Act passed that we knew, the Data Governance Act in Europe, that there would be challenges to looking at a brokerage approach to solving this problem. We actually had a project that pulled together data in conjunction with Curtin University and the Koki team, for those of you who may know them, where we were like, hey, we're going to bring together this information as a pilot. And what we found is the commercial parties were not willing to hand over that data to a repository to feed a dashboard with these analytics, which is where we decided we needed to fork. And so our community actually at that point in time said, well, you know what, if we can't harvest the data into one place to serve up these analytics, we need something like a Dataspace to make that possible. And lucky for us, we stumbled on the IDSA and the Dataspaces at that point in time. It has been remarkable. We've been working with individuals from over 5 continents in this journey. We've had support not just from Mellon, but a handful of organizations as well, and have been working with partners across the world. And I'll note my co-PIs on the current project, which really focuses on building the governance building blocks for our data space, are the Secretary General at OPRES and also the Chief Legal Advisor at OpenAir. And so we have an incredible dream team, as I like to think of it. And they have been willing to come along for the ride of what I like to say, that bleeding edge of innovation. Because as we've been talking to folks, people don't know what a data space is. So every organization we're encountering, we have to explain what it is, how it's different, and how this new technology could support where we want to go. I'll note in this journey, sustainability is a key piece, right? You build an infrastructure, you have to sustain it, you have to have a community that can sustain it. I'm based in the US. I shouldn't have, like, that causes some interesting challenges at this moment in time. But I'll note that we started with this focus on open access ebook usage, our OA-EBU, but quickly realized that the stakeholders in scholarly communications, if we start thinking of that as an industry, there are other types of operational data that is sensitive and proprietary that would need to be aggregated and benchmarked to support strategic decision making. And so based on our sustainability modeling over the past year and a half, our board has actually elected to shift its focus so that we could be more extensible and support more use cases among the same set of stakeholders. So that brings us to where we are today, which is to really focus on launching this data space as a trusted data hub, where entities can come and offer up their data with very specific usage policies to others, and others can go to this one spot to find the data that they need. So they're managing a single API instead of many, a single participation agreement instead of many. And it provides that scalability, not only by reducing costs and the time associated with negotiating those agreements, but by giving our data providers that data sovereignty and, along the way, increased transparency around how those data assets are being used in the ecosystem. We are so thrilled. So we took 15 months to create a rulebook, which we'll talk about in a moment. But the rulebook for us really had to highlight what trust indicators were, what the rules of participation were, how do you trust the folks that are exchanging data in this ecosystem and the ones running it. Everyone wanted the technology first. And I'm a data governance person, so I'm like, no, the governance is the hard part. We're gonna focus on governance. And every turn I took, every conversation I had, they're like, we need the thing. Let us play with the thing. We waited until it was all done. The thing took 4 months to build, 4 months. The rest took 2.5 years. And it was only because we worked through the trust and governance issues that we could execute the agreements between parties to use the thing. So I'll note that we are very lucky that we did a small-scale minimum viable pilot this year. The build started in February. It was done by June. And then we had our parties on board with each organization taking under 20 hours to connect their data and offer it up. Again, very limited use case, but we had already gone through the hard part of defining what trust looked like, defining what metadata and indicators had to go with it, and what those usage policies were. So then it was just a matter of operationalizing. We also benefited because our pilot partners came along for the ride. They've been with us on this project, so we weren't starting from scratch in terms of education. So you've seen my fun 3 levels. I thought it might be useful to walk through them in terms of the details of our specific minimum viable data space and where we've been so far. So for us, the way things now work is, let's talk about the technology. We'll talk about the thing. I know you're all really excited about the tech. And I'll have some more detailed pictures here in a bit. But this is an AWS stack using open source software, the Eclipse Data Connector, which is its own standard that's been road tested in other data spaces. We were able to partner with ThinkIt, which happens to be the firm that wrote the prescriptive guidance for AWS on how to build data spaces, and they've worked with multiple data spaces. So they could come in and bring their expertise to run this data space, to build it and then help us run it as infrastructure, as code. So they provided the data space as a service, a managed service for us to pilot as minimum viable. But that is only possible because we had already figured out who the coordinating office would be for this data space, who was executing these agreements with the providers and the participants on behalf of the data space ecosystem. We're very lucky that Oprah CU is playing that role for us. So they were the ones that would negotiate that contract with ThinkIt, as well as be the one to negotiate those contracts with the individual participants that you saw on the last screen. It is through Oprah and ThinkIt that we were able to then issue verified credentials for each of those participants. And this key is very important because something that came out in our trust indicators in the rulebook process is that every entity that came and offered data in the space had to be a legal entity with legal authority over that data. So they could be held responsible not only for describing it, making it available, but if they were a recipient, they could be held responsible for if something happened downstream. And so the legal, the ownership was put back upon those participants. They had to carry that weight and realize they were carrying that weight by participating in this ecosystem. Individuals cannot participate. It has to be through an organization. In this technical stack, though, what you can see the way this works, and we have videos of people who see really boring things because it's minimum viable, it's all code, so you can watch someone type in code if you want. I don't think it's particularly exciting, but if you like that, come find me. The data providers goes in there and they configure their data asset, they describe it, add in the metadata, they define those usage policies if it's limited to one organization, one participant, one group. For our minimum viable, we just did a usage restriction based on organizations. So I mentioned they were usage reports. Usage reports are routing between organizations. We didn't get more granular than that, but you could. You could say they could have access for a certain period of time. They could have access just to use with this AI agent. We just didn't pilot that in this case. And then our recipients went into their catalogs, could see the data that had been shared with them, and initiate the negotiation. And this is where the magic really happened, because when our recipients would go in, request the data to come down, behind the scenes, what the machines would do is they would look and call to see if there was a match between the usage policy and the usage request. If it matched, the data flowed. If it didn't, it wouldn't, in addition to the data not being discoverable. The data itself, though, always stayed local. This was never centralized in the data space. And so it flowed party to party when necessary. I do want to stop and pause and talk about the organizational and legal components and really that accountability layer, because I think this is a huge piece of why the data space is possible. And this is what took us nearly 3 years to work through. There's a rulebook for the IDSA that talks about how the organization works. But as you think of a data space instance, there has to be a way to make transparent to all participants what that organization is, how it is led, how it maintains trust over time. And so we actively went through this process where we had in-person workshops, we had a task team that worked through details for over a year, and iterative community consultations through focus groups and online forums and in-person conferences, all to identify what the trust indicators were, and how this ecosystem could run in a trusted fashion. Everything we're doing is open, so the rulebook is out in Zenodo. You can look at all our research outputs. The process to get to this rulebook we documented as well. But because we worked through that and then were able to document it, we then were able to work with, and again with Pro over at Open Air, and our legal team at ICE Miller, we could then figure out how do we take the intent in that rulebook and turn it into standard contractual clauses for all participants. The identity management, the access management, and the usage policies together are what allows us to maintain that trust across these data pipelines, the data connectors. And I think it's really important to underscore here that the data itself never comes to Oprah's, never goes to ThinkIt. It is only that negotiated contract layer that is working within the data space. And the thing that I think is really impressive is the scalability of that. If you think of the ability for a data space to automate in real time that negotiation to make sure there's a match between the contract terms, you're taking out the manual process of it sitting in someone's inbox, of someone going to say, oh, I need to go talk to legal, I need to go talk to this office, I need to talk to this office. Now it's machine actionable and it can flow. Taking out a piece of that. The trust indicators, I think, are really interesting, but I think I should note too, something we've learned is this is highly specific to the use case. You'll recall that I'm talking only about open access book stakeholders, so libraries, publishers, presses, aggregators, those who have a stake in usage reporting. Those were the entities that were at the table when we started talking through this and creating the rulebook. For them, we're talking about usage. How many people here know about counter, code of practice, and usage data? Okay, that's what I thought. So in our field, that type of data, there is a code of practice in our industry that provides a standard way. So you might want to say, okay, if you have web analytics, how do you handle bots? There is a standard way to do that. But as we all know with standards, not everyone can adopt them for various reasons. Sometimes cost, sometimes scale, sometimes capacity. So what do? And you have a choice, right? You could say, okay, you're not allowed to participate, or you allow them to participate, but you make it transparent. Going back to the concept that data spaces are neutral, and our job is to make transparent what the variability in this data is, instead of saying you had to be compliant with the standard. What came out is that we needed to identify what that variability of trust is for that usage data element. So we actually came up with not just that one trust indicator. Oh no, that'd be too simple. We have 10. And as you see represented here, a handful of them, it wasn't even a binary, descriptor. So on the right side of the slide, you'll see there were text-based descriptors that our stakeholders said, it's important for us just for usage data for open access books to know what the provenance is. Where did this come from? Are you up or downstream when that data is created, or were you the platform that actually created it? What was the data processing methodology? How was it cleaned, normalized, et cetera, before it got shared? What quality assurance measures are in place before that got shared? Are there any licensing terms that need to be applied? That text-based, easy. Although one of those, I said in the session before this, I think we need a controlled vocabulary for usage terms, just as a footnote. Again, we're research development here. The other indicators, what we found out is that there were levels of trust. So you could have a low state of trust and a high state of trust and something in between. I know, pretty wishy-washy, but what happened is we were able to define for those low, medium, and high levels of trust descriptors so that when people made their data available in the data space, they could reflect what their data fell into. Let me go back to that counter code of practice. We have the standard. If you think of a PDF you like to read, well, if that's just on a website, you may have Google Analytics, for example. That is not as trusted as something that is Counter. And Counter itself runs a third-party audit service. So if you are audited and certified, you're in a registry. That registry is our highest level of trust. Counter conformant, hey, we did all the steps, but we couldn't pay to be certified. That's a middle level for us. But it's not Counter, it's something else. That's a low level of trust, and that's okay. We still want it to be able to be reflected in this ecosystem. The key, though, is making it transparent. So we have a number of indicators like that: data delivery, granularity, consistency. When's the last time you changed how you calculated this data? These were all things that people wanted to understand about the element that was coming to them so that it could then be machine actioned. So as I wrap things up here, I just want to note that this is not easy. So every data space has to make that jump to sustainability. And I would like to say I thought I had a challenge before when I took my job and I had to raise what a data space was and during the pandemic when none of us could travel. And then I had to raise funding for sustainability in 2025 for a new startup for something that no one's ever heard of before. That's a fun challenge. The key thing here, though, is there's a chicken and egg problem with data spaces. The value from participating in this kind of hub comes when you have a critical mass of parties that are there. So it does become a one-stop shop. Organizations see that value, but they don't want to put the money in to invest, to connect if they're one of the first ones there. And that's a challenge we are trying to navigate right now. We're in the middle of a silent capital campaign to raise essentially the bridge funding to get us so that we can launch our membership and launch those fees for sustainability. And it's going to be dependent on that as to whether we launch this minimum viable data space next year. There are many recurring cost recovery mechanisms that we can turn on once we have membership and we have that ongoing service. But in the meantime, we got to make sure that we have that foundation in place. For those who really like to see the pictures of the infrastructure, I know we like to talk tech in here. This is all up on GitHub. It is all Apache 2.0 based on the Eclipse data connector, which itself is open source. So all of this is out there. If you have questions, you can look at it. We did build it on the AWS stack, given the partners we were working with. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them as I can. So that was a perspective from an industrial data space. And what I'd like to do now, because I was curious if there would be other data space folks, people who are working on this in the audience, and I've already heard from a handful in various other presentations. And I want to go ahead and start with Lee, because we were just chatting at the Canada booth. I was like, you're doing data spaces? Great, you need to come talk too. So literally, he just gave me these slides like 5 minutes ago. So let's go, Mike, thank you.
I think we're set. Sorry. Perfect. Thanks so much, Christina. Yeah, I mean, I think this really speaks to the value of International Data Week and the research and RDA plenaries, and particularly the BOF format, where we can, do these kinds of ad hoc, sort of informal presentations, but also join the conversation. So, hi, Lee Wilson. I'm the Director for Research Data Management at the Digital Research Alliance of Canada, and this is my colleague.
Victoria Smith, Manager of Research Data Services at the Alliance.
And happy to take just a few minutes here to share some of the new and exciting initiatives that are happening through the Alliance, and particularly related to the Dataspaces conversation. So first, a little bit of context. Who are we? We are a national academic not-for-profit organization funded through the federal government of Canada. We have a mandate to advance digital research infrastructure in Canada, and we coordinate, support, and operate a wide variety of services across DRI focused on research data management, advanced research computing, and research software. So just a couple of quick facts. We work with over 26,000 researchers across Canada, manage national DRI workforce, as well as ensure that we are a neutral allocator of public compute through our annual resource allocation competition. So this is just giving you a sense of the context in which we work. It's sort of research, Canadian research data in the numbers. So you can see the number of Canadian data repositories that exist across the country that are operating, the amount of data that we're sort of talking about, the number of data sets that are published. So this is all happening across a wide variety of different national data services, or data services, some of which are national, some of which are supported by the Alliance, some of which are operated by the Alliance. So we operate a variety of data repositories, data discovery services, data management planning services, and services related to infrastructure, so infrastructure and advanced research computing, as well as things like persistent identifier programs. So it's a broad mandate with a lot of different services in operation. So now what I'd like to talk about, and just to set the context for our Dataspaces, is some of the activities that we're doing under a new initiative related to sovereign AI compute within, which is an initiative of the federal government of Canada. So the first one is the Canadian Research Data Platform. So this initiative takes a look at where we are in terms of our current operations. So we have a variety of national data services, as I talked about, provisioning services to researchers across the country. So it's taking a look at that current landscape and understanding where our gaps are today and what we need to do to develop, both in terms of filling some of those gaps and creating a more holistic or interconnected set of services across both research data management, advanced research computing, and research software. So starting kind of at the bottom of this overview of this initiative is infrastructure. So we've recognized that there is an infrastructure gap, particularly related to storage. So we'll be looking to develop a distributed storage and compute grid that's built on object store technology that'll provide a national backbone or underpinning for storage of research data across Canada, in particular for data that's living in that active research space. We also provide identity and access management across the country, so wanting to continue to develop those services and work towards a more integrated suite of national data services. So we have these different services, they're in production and they're well used, but they're quite siloed in the sense that there's no interconnective tissue that guides a researcher across the research data lifecycle and moves them sort of from one service to the next. So that's a big part of this initiative, starting to create those connective tissues and pull those services together. At the same time, we want to centralize this to a certain extent from a user perspective and have that single researcher dashboard where they can now start to access different national services across the different functions. So again, not just tying together the data services, but also tying data services together with our advanced research computing services. So that is, in a nutshell, sort of the Canadian Research Data Platform initiative. And it's building on what we already do very well, which is providing services to researchers, but it's any and all researchers, right? So these services need to be available to support researchers across all disciplines. In that sense, they are, by definition, quite multidisciplinary and somewhat generalist. The National Dataspaces initiative that is just getting off the ground now is building on the great work that's been happening internationally, some of which you heard about today, so that we can work with disciplinary data communities at varying levels of maturity and start to bring them into the national framework in a systematic, structured, and meaningful way. And this just speaks to some of the issues that the Canadian Research Data Platform is looking to solve. So I won't linger too much on this slide. And of course, as I said, this is all just getting off the ground now. So we're right in the middle of our engagement plan, which involves things like town halls, focus groups, a variety of working groups that are being formed, as well as pulling people together for national data summits to continue these conversations. And with that, I'll turn it over to Victoria to speak to the Dataspaces part of it.
So thank you. I'm very excited to be able to talk about this program with you all. It's something that I'm just like genuinely very excited about, and it's nice to be in a room with folks that are also very excited about Dataspaces, or at least interested or curious about them. So we're thinking, what is a data space in the Canadian context? And so we've already heard today a little bit about what's happening internationally in that space, what's happening with some colleagues to the south, with some colleagues here in Australia. Of course, we always consult CODATA when we want to know what something is. So CODATA has provided us with a definition for data spaces, but we're also looking to Europe that has quite a robust and advanced data spaces program. We're looking to our colleagues at ARDC and really trying to understand the important distinctions between data commons and data spaces, but also how different solutions and infrastructures and governance systems lend themselves to different approaches, different service delivery models, to try and understand what it means to support data spaces in the Canadian context. So luckily, we are working virtually in lockstep with our federal funders. So the Canadian federal government has recently published work on data governance in the context of scientific data and research data more broadly. So luckily, we're in a position where much of the work that we're doing, if not all the work that we're doing in this context, is very much aligned with recently articulated federal priorities. What are we proposing? I would say the first thing is that while we're looking very much at the sort of infrastructure and systems architecture that we've been hearing about today, we're also approaching this a little bit more holistically to look broadly at the DRI that's used within a particular research discipline. So certainly data sharing and data sharing from a data spaces model, so not situating ourselves as a broker or a steward necessarily of those data, but is creating the space or the environment in which data owners and stewards are able to connect with data users and execute on machine actionable data usage or sharing agreements. But also looking a bit more broadly at the platforms, tools, and systems and services that research disciplinary communities are popularly using with those data, and how we can support the development of that work a bit more holistically. So I like to think about data spaces a little bit philosophically because my academic background is in philosophy. And while I find that to be very interesting, it's not necessarily helpful. So let's get specific and precise. What are we talking about when we are talking about data spaces, and particularly the funding program that we're launching now in Canada? We are talking about storage infrastructure. So as you heard from Lee, we provide storage infrastructure, but we know that there are critical partners active in research disciplinary environments that are funding and providing storage for data that they steward today. What does that environment look like? What is the funding model for those different types of storage? Typically, it's a bit fragmented, it's a bit insecure, so we need to understand that reality. But communities of experts. So we've heard a lot about the significance of governance in the context of data spaces so far today. This is a critical part of our funding pilot program that we've launched, or that we're in the process of launching. So what we're really looking to research disciplinary communities to do is to put funding toward advancing governance within these spaces. So it's not just about immediately investing in coding different pieces of middleware or things like that. Like, what we really want is for disciplinary communities to connect and discuss what are the governance models that exist today, however formal or informal, with regard to the data that's used quite popularly within their disciplines, and what do we want to be aiming toward aspirationally with regard to the governance model within that community. And certainly that's not something that we want to dictate. Our role is to facilitate that work, that determination within a research disciplinary community. So what we've done is we're launching a funding program where communities can put forth a vision, a plan for how they're going to use that funds or those funds, and certainly bringing their community together to discuss these issues, setting clear objectives for what progress means in the context of governance, but helping to support that work. As we heard from Christina, 2 years or 3 years to make significant progress on governance is an excellent achievement. So we don't want to underestimate the work that's involved. Certainly we'd be foolish to do that. But we do want to be aspirational. We want to set goals, and we want to provide adequate funding that will enable disciplinary communities to do that work. And then third, of course, is software and platforms. So it's one thing to know where the data are and have them securely stored. It's another to have clear, agreed-upon governance systems in place. I'd suggest you're wildly lucky if you find yourself in possession of both of those things. But if you still don't have the means to analyze data and to do the sort of research that you're looking to do with those data, what's the point of it all? So we're looking holistically at this funding program, not only to facilitate data sharing and data exchange, but a holistic look at really what are the digital spaces that a disciplinary community takes up. We will never have the expertise that a disciplinary community has on its needs. So this is a funding model, a funding program that's designed to enable disciplinary communities to articulate their needs and their vision, their aspirational sort of holistic vision for what their community could look like in a few years' time, both with regard to governance and data sharing, but also with regard to the very cool tools that they would like to be using to conduct research with. This is a diagram that people seem to like. So what we're trying to depict here is a reality where infrastructure, research communities, software and platforms are disconnected. They exist, certainly, but they're more or less siloed. What we'd like to see, what we consider to be a more matured data space or data community, are ones where there are circles now around some of these things and they're starting to form constellations. And certainly the aspirational end state to which we're all aiming is one in which there are clearly articulated data communities, data spaces that are established wherein all of these infrastructure, communities, software platforms, and so on are interconnected effectively and interoperable among each other. This is probably more relevant locally, but as we're sharing this with Canadian researchers, with folks doing research in Canada, Canadian research institutions, they have many questions, as they should, including what do you mean by a disciplinary community and who is eligible for this funding? So this is not meant to be prescriptive, but to give folks at home some ideas on who we think would be eligible to apply for this funding. Certainly we're encouraging folks all across the board to do so. But just to give a sense of what we mean by this, the breadth and the depth of a disciplinary community, that can be quite broad or quite narrow, and the different sorts of potentially eligible applicants. So certainly this is a funding program designed for organizations and initiatives, not like an individual PI. Really what we're looking for are data stewards who want to step up and play a significant role in structuring and supporting the governance of a data space for a particular research disciplinary community. Maturity models are a critical part of this from our perspective insofar as it's going to help enable us to distribute funding. It's difficult to compare apples and oranges, and certainly disciplinary communities, it's hard, there are no apples to apples, so it's a comparisons there. This is not entirely determinate in terms of how we're looking at awarding funding, but it helps us to provide some categories and some guardrails around different types of community maturity. Really, I think we're looking at this as an opportunity to provide something aspirational to research communities. Please dream big in terms of what you want your research discipline to look like in 5 years' time or 10 years' time. And please see a clear roadmap for how that could be achieved in terms of governance objectives, but also mechanisms that enable data sharing, as well as analytics tools and platforms and so on, and articulate that vision to us so that we can help to fund it and help to realize it. So wanting to give communities something to aim toward that's aspirational but also achievable. So that's more about that piece. What are the expected benefits? I think there's a lot of them. So as you've heard from myself and from Lee today, this is a program we're really excited about. It connects really critically to work that we're doing on our Canadian Research Data Platform, which, as Lee mentioned, is quite centrally managed. It's more discipline agnostic. It's more generalizable. I think what the Dataspaces program gets at is more so the specificity of research disciplines and the fact that communities are always going to be diverse and distinct, and they will know and understand their needs far better than we ever will as a centralized funding and service providing body. So this program is designed to really put them in the driver's seat with regard to what their data sharing and the digital environment in which they interact with each other, the shape that all of that takes. And we hope will make take very practical step forwards and enormous benefits to particularly how data sharing happens, but also how data sharing interacts more broadly with research workflows and the production of research outputs. So thank you very much for the opportunity to share this work with this community. Thank you.
Okay, that was seriously amazing for just finding out about this yesterday. That was fantastic. Are there any others in the room working on Dataspaces? Don't be shy. You don't have to have a slide deck, I promise. Okay. So with that, this brings us back to group discussion. And before we shift into discussion, I should open the floor to questions, because what we did want to do here is understand if there is room in the RDA or interest, really, for us to create something like a BOF or an interest group or even a working group if there is work to be done. And this really, all depends on some key discussion questions. So before we shift to these, and I have a Mentimeter, we've thrown a lot of information at you all, and you've been a fantastic audience. I do want to open the floor up for questions. So let me find the roaming mic. We got a couple here and here.
Thank you. Rosie Hicks from the Australian Research Data Commons. And Andrew, you may well have the same question as me, but we'll try. So as we've heard from Kheeran, ARDC is looking at the implementation of the IDSA data space concept in Australia. But one of the things that I can't answer, and perhaps someone here can expand on a little bit, I think the word data spaces is used within Europe, both in the IDSA sense, but also with the health data space. Is it through the Commission? Yeah, and it's the distinction between those two that I'm not really clear on the distinction, but I think they are quite different. And particularly in the Finland example, both were mentioned, and I believe that needs to be teased out a little bit more.
I am a big fan of defining our terms. So, and honestly, I've had people say, hey, I have a data space. I do think one element, and so this is just my take, the Dataspace Protocol going to ISO is going to give us a framework that we can reference to see if something actually is a data space with, and I put the quotes up there very intentionally. But I think in our lexicon, we've been using that phrase for a very long time. And so getting to this point where data space means something specific is a change process we're all going to have to go through as well. So I don't know the particulars. Maybe someone in this room does with respect to the European health data space, but my assumption is that probably has been evolving as the protocol has as well. And that disconnect, I don't know how they're bringing it together. If there is
I don't know. Andrew Trelaw, Australian Research Data Commons. I also don't know if there is one. I tend to think of big D data spaces and little d data spaces. And I think we've seen examples of both. I have a really mundane question and a comment. The mundane question is the slides that are linked from the collaborative notes didn't include the late edition of the Canadian slides. Lee, I'd love to look at your slides in greater detail. Is there going to be a way that we can get access?
We'll find a way.
We'll find a way, okay. Okay, if they could be linked into the collaborative notes, that would be really helpful. And then the comment I wanted to make was, and maybe this relates back to the big D and little d data spaces, the list of things you put under Dataspaces, you said you need storage infrastructure, so I'm pointing at both of you, I guess now. Storage infrastructure, communities of experts, research software and platforms. We need to talk, because that looks a whole lot like the list of things that we would put for our thematic research data commons that we're building in Australia. And so we started building the thematic research data commons, long history, I won't go into it, and then thought maybe the big D Dataspaces architecture can help us with shaping some of that, and in particular shaping the interactions with industry. And it sounds like you're maybe doing it the other way around, I don't know. But anyway, it sounds like we're trying to solve the same kinds of problems in the same kinds of ways. We need to talk.
Any other questions, comments?
Thank you. I've got many questions for you, Christina. I'm so sorry. Only two for the moment. First, so in the example you provided, sorry, Pascal Perez, Orin. Thank you. I'm shy, you know that. Not. Sorry, serious. In your example, so you've got commercial providers accepting to provide under certain circumstances and clear rules of engagement data and metadata to researchers or libraries. Is there a commercial or monetized access for some of these commercial providers? That's the first question. And how do you handle it? Is it upstream or as part of the process? And on the other side, you mentioned the fact that for the moment, it feels like it's a feed-forward process where the rules are put in there and they are clear, and the recipients, they put a request, and the request has to match what the... Okay, do you see a future when the providers would have access to requests that do not match the conditions, being able to assess that and say, maybe we can start expanding the rules? So, sorry, a little bit.
Yeah, no, and to answer the last one, that's a bit easier. They can see it come in. So we have it on our roadmap right now. It was all, it was a small group. We worked with 6 organizations, but the intent would be if there wasn't a match, that the provider would be notified, and then they could follow up again offline, because that would typically indicate that the data sharing agreement wasn't in place or something was misconfigured, so they could follow up. To your first question, sorry, now I'm already losing track. The money. So, no, I love that question, because the model itself is very customizable. It actually has data consumer, as you saw, and the ability for people to monetize the assets that flow through the database. Our specific use case in Scholarly Communications, there was zero interest in anyone monetizing usage data. And so we very intentionally changed the language in our rulebook so it was data recipient and not data consumer, so that the data itself wasn't monetized. That said, that doesn't mean there isn't money, because we have to sustain the cloud, we have to sustain the actual environment that is being coordinated, the coordination staff. So to participate is not free. And the model that we've developed has not only membership with tiered fees based on organizational budget, but it also has scalable usage fees, so that if an entity connected to the data space with all kinds of calls running in a very high frequency, that burden on the system would be charged back, compared to some that are smaller where it could just be absorbed by the system. So we did put a lot of time into what would be reasonable. And again, chicken and egg, the hope is that as you have an entire ecosystem on it, those costs could come down, but it's just a matter of timing.
So just adding to that one, Pascal, in the IDSA architecture, there are 21 usage classes that have been defined. So any of those ones, once you've got that infrastructure that's in place, any of the providers can put any of those usage classes and say what it needs to be, and one of them is monetizing it. So there's lots of options in there once you get that set up.
I know, but it was just like there's an implementation there to see whether this was put in practice.
See if I did this right. So with that, if there are any questions, we really want to get your feedback, everyone, on specifically where do we go from here. As I told you at the beginning, I am very, very excited. In fact, I'm going to get a picture of all of you because no one will believe me when I'm like, hey, no, really. I filled an entire room at the RDA, so you can all smile if you want. You're going to think I'm crazy. Because seriously, this is really exciting for me. I'm curious, what do you think? Is there something we need to do in the RDA community to align and prepare for the work that's being done in data spaces, recognizing we all work in research infrastructure? This is the first question. You can do the QR code, do it on your phone. If you're on your computer, you can go to menti.com and type in 17072788. I like whoever put second BOF because one of the next poll questions is going to be, should we have a BOF or an interest group or something? So I like how you're thinking. A landscape report. Landscape of data space related activities, I presume? Feel free to shout it out if you know. For those who are putting in definition work, is there specific definitions you'd like to see? I know, I think I mentioned to someone already, I personally would love to see some work done around usage policy definitions, so we can say when a use is allowed or not allowed. There could be some kind of controlled vocabulary. I like how someone already has a third BOF. You guys are like longevity. I like it.
Probably can't have a third BOF.
Right. So, okay. Everyone's ideas are in? I don't see anyone typing. I am going to shift to the next question. This one I think is really important. How do you see this work around data spaces fitting in with the other existing RDA interest groups and working groups? Are you involved in another effort in the RDA that relates to this, where we should be coordinating? If so, which ones? Sensitive data? Yeah. Any others? Virtual research environments? Yeah. AI data visitation. The working group, so trusted research environment, what's SD? Shout it out. I don't know if I know that one. Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay. So I would love to hear from the person who said swap directions. Are you shy? Are you willing to talk? Because I think, so yeah, I'll bring you the mic. I'd love to hear more about that. So mapping RDA outputs to data spaces, what are you thinking?
So I was thinking, the data spaces are at a very exciting stage. So there is the framework there, but they are evolving. Mm-hmm. And I don't see, or I can't almost think of a single RDA output or working group that wouldn't map into one or other aspect of data spaces, be it on the technology level, on the policy level, on the domain-specific aspects, because you have domain-specific data spaces. So I remember in the RDA we had long discussions of how we could get an overview of whatever was going on in the RDA, which is a flood. So it's a dangerous suggestion. But basically we could take the exercise and say, here is all the RDA outputs of the past 10, 12 years. Here is all the ongoing activities. Where would they contribute to the rule book, to a use case study, to a technology recommendation? And maybe by that, actually get all the community agreed services, recommendations into the data spaces. Because they are basically an umbrella across all that the RDA is doing, isn't it?
I think there's a lot of connection points.
So
figuring out those connections.
I think, mapping, and this is why I said swap it. So because you said, where does data spaces contribute to the other working groups? I would take whatever the other working groups are doing and say, where does this help building the data spaces that we are aiming for?
So, and that is a good reminder just to note for folks, and I'm sad that the IDSA doesn't have folks here. They actually have their own conference going on right now in Tokyo. But know that it is another open community like the RDA. So if this is something you're interested in, you can join the IDSA. You can participate in those working groups. But coming back to RDA for a moment, I think this is the key question. Where do we go from here? I'm so excited we've gone from 2 people to a room of people. I'm a little nervous. We can't keep expanding at that rate in terms of people. Well, maybe we could, but it'd be a lot harder to manage. What do you think we should do next? we have a plenary coming up. I know proposals are due here within the month for what we'd want to do if there was interest in coming together. Wow, it sounds like an interest group is forming. Okay. For those who are selecting working group, what in particular would you like to see as the outcome? And I can bring you the mic.
Do the mapping, that would be one of the activities.
My vote would actually be both interest group and working group too, but only because I think we could have a working group focused on the usage policy controlled vocabulary. I think we really need that. Anyone else thinking of a working group idea?
Same reason that I think that mapping exercise across it will be fantastic.
Okay. So given where we're at, so for those of you, everyone I hope has the collaborative notes. They should be accessible in the program. If you are interested in joining the interest group, please go in the collaborative notes and note that. Hopefully someone has it open and at the bottom could just be like, sign up here for an interest group. Put your name in there and we know we can, and your email if it's not already in the list, so that we can contact you and we can organize from there. If you are interested in a working group to focus on, it sounds like a landscape scan. Is that fair? I don't know the right way to frame it, but if you're interested in a working group conversation around that mapping, go ahead and put that in the notes as well, and we can have folks reach out there. So with that, any other questions, comments?
In terms of technicality, work group has a term, 18 months term. So if you don't want to work within the time frame, you could start IG, and then within that, you can create a test group. That's what CCO implementation IG is doing. Then you don't have that time restriction, but you can create an individual test group, for example, control vocabulary, test group, whatever test group you create, needed, and then that one can be more focused,
So I was just going to say I've added a column to the attendee check-in table at the top, just so you can just tick yes if you're interested in the interest group.
Thank you so much. I love that. Okay. Any other comments or suggestions for the good of the order? Excellent. Well, with that, thank you, everyone. Give yourselves a round of applause. This was a fantastic session after lunch. We made progress. It might not feel like progress, but seriously, thank you everyone for being here and for listening and participating. We appreciate it.